Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I want to start by acknowledging that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. My name is Michael Mastrandrea, and I am the Research Director of the Climate and Energy Policy Program, which is part of Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. The Woods Institute is a founding pillar of the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability and is celebrating 20 years of sustainability leadership, bringing together scholars from across Stanford to advance understanding and develop practical, just solutions to pressing environmental problems. The Climate and Energy Policy Program combines interdisciplinary research with direct policy engagement, serving as a practical, timely, and neutral voice informing decision-making on climate and energy law and regulation. Today, we will be presenting new work focused on electricity affordability, an increasingly important concern for many Californians. This work has been led by Lane Smith, a postdoctoral fellow with the Climate and Energy Policy Program. Lane will outline a new approach to allocating the California climate credit that could be a near-term action to better support low-income electricity customers, particularly those in hotter parts of the state. And this will be followed by a broader discussion of electricity affordability measures and solutions with a panel of energy experts moderated by Michael Wara, director of the Climate and Energy Policy Program. There will be an opportunity for questions from the audience during the panel, so please submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A feature, and we will get to as many of them as possible. Now it's my pleasure to hand it over to Lane to present our work.
As was mentioned, today I'll be presenting some of our recent work that we released in a policy brief that looks at a new method for being able to provide some electricity bill relief to low-income Californians. Before I proceed, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge funding from Stanford's Bits and Watts initiative, which helps support this work. You don't have to live in California or necessarily research in this space to know that California has really high electricity prices. This is something that has been covered pretty well in the media over the last couple years here, where we've seen in this past year headlines that indicate that California now has the second highest electricity prices in the country, and that California's electricity prices are increasing at a rate that outpaces that of inflation. If you want to start digging into a little bit more some of the causes behind why California has such high electricity prices, you can look at some of the different climate mitigation and adaptation measures that the state has pushed for, namely increased investment in the state's transmission and distribution infrastructure, increased hardening against wildfire risks, as well as cost shifts from some of the state's utilities' climate programs. And it appears that some of these costs are going to continue to increase in coming years, where there will be continued need for more wildfire hardening, as well as a need to modernize California's grid to be able to accommodate future electrification goals. Electricity prices, though, aren't just high and a challenge for everybody in the state. There are pockets of the state where these electricity affordability challenges are more acute. California's three largest investor-owned utilities, PG&E, Southern California Edison, and San Diego Gas and Electric, all serve large, diverse geographical regions. Here on the right, you can see a figure of PG&E's service territory, where they have customers sited in areas ranging from temperate coastline, which I just highlighted in blue, all the way to hot, lowland climate zones, such as the California Central Valley, which I just highlighted in orange. It is these low elevation inland areas, like the California Central Valley, that can be much hotter than those near the coast, which can result in greater cooling needs for customers, and as a result, higher electricity bills. In our work, we focus on the impacts that these high electricity rates have on low-income customers, where despite utilities discount programs such as CARE and FARA, low-income customers, especially those in some of the state's warmer climate zones, still face really high electricity bills, especially when you consider those bills as a percentage of household income. To put a slightly finer point on it, we can look at the discrepancies in monthly bills between low-income customers living in a coastal climate zone and in a warm climate zone. Here in this figure, you can see the monthly electricity bills for an average discounted customer living in a coastal climate zone. You can see that there is very small deviation in electricity bills here, and the bills are typically on the order of $100 per month. We can compare these to the electricity bills of an average discounted customer living in a warm climate zone in the state, where electricity bills are more expensive during each month, and especially more expensive during summer months, on the order of magnitude of hundreds of dollars more per month than what a customer living in a coastal region might pay. And so when we think about wanting to drive down this discrepancy and help some of these customers in the more expensive climate zones, we need to think about where we might be able to find the funds to be able to do so. In an effort to not pull funds from rates and create more rate-based cost shifts, we looked outside of electricity rates, and that led us to look at the California Climate Credit. The California Climate Credit is distributed by the investor-owned utilities to their ratepayers from proceeds earned through the state's cap and trade program. Currently, each household in an investor-owned utility service territory receives the same credit twice per year, once in April and once in October, and that credit is applied directly to their electric bill. If you're a PG&E customer, the figure at the bottom of my screen here might look familiar, where you'll receive this in April and October, indicating that you have this credit now applied to your electricity bill. And so we consider this pool of climate credit funds, and we want to think about how we can reallocate those in a way that can meet our goal of providing better targeted monthly bill support for these low-income customers enrolled in discount programs. What we proposed in our policy brief is using these available climate credit funds to reduce bills in the 4 highest bill months for discounted customers in each climate zone. Real quick, I'll make a couple brief notes on the design that we propose. First, discounted customers receive a climate credit payout that's commensurate with the total targeted reduction in their climate zone. While I'm only presenting to you today 2 sample climate zones, each investor-owned utility has a service territory that has multiple climate zones. PG&E, whose results that we'll be presenting on today, has 10 such climate zones. And so we want to make it clear that the climate credits that we're proposing to be redistributed to low-income customers in these territories are receiving credits that are proportional to the amount of support that those customers need. I'd also like to note that these discounted customers receive a climate credit payout that's no smaller than what they're currently receiving. We didn't want to hurt the ability of low-income customers who are living in coastal regions to still pay their bills, even if they are in a less difficult situation with their electricity bills than customers in warmer climate zones. In addition to this broad discussion of the mechanism that we propose, we also consider a few different scenarios. These scenarios are broadly situated around how we split up this climate credit pool to 2 very broad groups of customers. The first group of customers is the group of discounted customers. This includes customers participating in the CARE program or the FARA program. And these are the customers to whom we are trying to target most of this climate credit pool. The second group of customers that we consider are the group of undiscounted customers. These customers are not participating in the CARE program and not participating in the FARA program, though there are some scenarios that we do try to provide some of the climate credit pool to undiscounted customers, especially those living in some of the more expensive, warmer climate zones. Our first scenario is a business as usual case, where all customers receive the same original climate credit payouts that they currently receive. This is a baseline scenario that helps for comparison against the other 2 scenarios that I'll discuss. Our second scenario is the case where undiscounted customers in high-cost climate zones receive the original climate credit payouts that they currently receive. In PG&E, where we're looking at in today's webinar, of their 10 climate zones, we consider 5 to be high-cost climate zones, with these climate zones typically situated in the California Central Valley. The remaining climate credits not distributed to these undiscounted customers are then reallocated and distributed to discounted customers in the territories. And finally, in our third scenario, we consider the case where all climate credits are redistributed to discounted customers. This gives us an idea of the maximum amount of support that this mechanism could provide to these low-income discounted customers. I'll take some time to discuss the impact that our proposed reallocation scheme can have on low-income customers' bills. On this slide, I'll look at the impacts from an annual basis, and on the following slide, we'll look at things at a monthly scale. Here you can see the annual electricity bills for a customer living in a coastal climate zone and a low-income customer living in a warm climate zone across each of the three scenarios that we consider. Very briefly, we'll just talk through the results you're seeing for the coastal customer, where you can see that their annual electricity bill does not deviate across three scenarios. This is due to the piece in our mechanism design where we don't want to reduce the amount of climate credit provided to this low-income customer, even though they're living in the coastal climate zone. Moving on, we can talk about the annual electricity bills for the customer living in the warm climate zone, where you can see that the different scenario that we consider does impact the customer's annual electricity bill. In our second scenario, which is the case where some of the climate credit pool is retained for undiscounted customers, you can see that the low-income customer living in the warm climate zone can realize a reduction of 19% in their annual electricity bill compared against the business as usual case. When we look at our third scenario, which is the case where all of the climate credit pool is distributed to discounted customers, you can see that the low-income customer in the warm climate zone is able to realize a 24% reduction in their annual electricity bills relative to business as usual. These results are interesting because it shows that even when some of the climate credits are retained for undiscounted customers who may still be struggling to pay their bills as well, the low-income customers, especially those in the warm climate zone, are still able to realize really large and significant reductions in their annual electricity rates. We'll now talk through the impacts on customers' monthly bills. Here you can see the monthly electricity bills, again, for the customer living in the warm climate zone and the coastal climate zone. This is similar to the figure that we showed previously, though here we have now distributed the business as usual climate credit during the months in which those credits are currently distributed, so in April and October. As you can see, especially for the customer living in the warm climate zone, the current distribution of climate credits does little to help this customer during the hot, expensive summer months. Though this was originally done by design when the program was established over a decade ago, the new higher electricity rates dictate that we need to provide more support during these more expensive months. So in doing so, we consider a case here, which you can now see in the dashed orange line, where we are providing the reallocated climate credit that's calculated for scenario 2, but it's now redistributed during times that are most expensive for the customer living in the warm climate zone. In this case, that falls during the summer months. Here you can see that this has a general flattening effect on the customer's bills, reducing their maximum summer bills from over $300 a month by over 50%, where the customer now pays under $150 a month during the summer months. So before I wrap up and send this back over to the panel, I would like to highlight a few things. First, we can see through the slides that we've done, as well as the policy proposal that we've put out, that reallocating the California climate credit to better target the state's low-income customers can be quite impactful. For low-income customers, their annual electricity bills can be reduced by at least 19% in warm climate zones, and low-income customers' monthly electricity bills during summer months could be reduced by over 50% in warm climate zones. In addition to some of the affordability benefits that I've discussed today, we also believe that reallocating the climate credit can be impactful in a couple different areas. First, we believe that it could be impactful for public health, where studies have shown that low-income customers living in warmer climates who are exposed to high electricity prices are less willing to use their cooling loads for fear of realizing higher electricity bills. We believe that providing a larger climate credit that can be more targeted to the times that the customer most needs them can encourage those customers to be able to use their cooling loads to help prevent them from being exposed to higher indoor air temperatures that may prove fatal. We also believe that reallocating the climate credit could be impactful on bill arrearages in the state. Proportionally, there are more low-income customers in arrears in the state than non-low-income customers. And we believe that low-income customers living in some of the most expensive climate zones in the state are probably more unlikely to be able to pay their bills on time. We feel that our reallocated climate credit, as well as changing the timing of this larger magnitude climate credit, could not only help these customers pay their bills, preventing them from going into debt and potentially being disconnected, we believe this could have broader applications and broader implications, rather, on the rest of the rate base, where if rates aren't being used to recover arrearages, it could potentially reduce electricity prices for all customers. In closing, I'd like to note that meaningful electricity price reductions are going to rely on a mix that includes solutions that provide near-term relief, such as the type of proposal that I've shown here today. But in the long run, we will also need larger, more transformational changes to the way that utility costs are incurred, allocated, and recovered. Thank you for listening to our webinar today. And at this point, I would like to send it back to Michael Wara and the rest of our panel.
My name is Michael Wara. I direct the Climate and Energy Policy Program at the Woods Institute in collaboration with Mike Mastrandrea, who launched our webinar. And I'm going to invite our panelists. We have a really excellent panel of three stakeholders in the both the electricity and the climate space in California to share perspectives. First, we have and to engage in a conversation both amongst each other and with the audience on the issue of energy affordability and the degree to which it and the approaches to leveraging our climate policies to both encourage energy affordability and also to maintain our focus and support for continued progress on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, in particular from the electric sector and from sectors that are electrifying as a means to reduce emissions. I'll just introduce our panelists briefly, then they are going to spend a few minutes just sharing each perspective on the issues and perhaps on the proposal that Lane also just spoke about, and then we'll engage in a conversation. Our first panelist is Linda Sarazawa. She is the director of the Public Advocate's Office. For those folks who don't know, the Public Advocate's Office is a division of the public or an element of the Public Utilities Commission in California, whose role is to serve as a public advocate for maintaining electricity affordability, keeping rates as low as possible, consistent with safety, reliability, and the state's climate goals. Linda has spent I think her entire career working in service to the state of California in the energy space at the PUC. She's been with the Public Advocate's Office since 2008 and assumed the leadership role last year. In addition, we have Carla Peterman, who is the Executive Vice President for Corporate Affairs and also the Chief Sustainability Officer for Pacific Gas and Electric Corporation. Carla has also served in a wide variety of roles in state leadership in the energy space. She was an energy commissioner before she was a public utilities commissioner. We served together on the Wildfire Commission after she stepped down from the Utilities Commission. And she's then worked both for Southern California Edison and PG&E in government relations and corporate affairs role. Last but not least, we have Caitlin Rodner-Sutter, who is the California State Director for the Environmental Defense Fund. Caitlin's work really began with engagement on environmental justice issues in Stockton. Since joining EDF a number of years ago, she's really led state engagement both on climate policy, both in California and across the West. And so I'm really excited to have the three panelists with us, and they really represent a diversity of perspectives. And that's really what we're hoping for in this conversation about what the path forward looks like for California, what things we need to do to achieve our kind of co-equal goals of affordability for electric customers, but also safety, reliability, and a clean electric system that will be I think of it as a pilot where the pilot scale is 40 million people, but will be a model perhaps for others to emulate in achieving both an equitable, an affordable, a safe, and also a greenhouse gas free system that can create prosperity. So I'm going to let Linda Sarazawa lead off and just step back for a moment and let each of the presenters share a perspective. Linda will be followed by Carla and then by Caitlin in sharing just providing a brief perspective on the issues around energy affordability and climate policy, and then we'll have some questions. Linda, take it away.
All right. Good morning, everybody. And by the way, I want to thank Michael Wara and Michael Mastrandrea for inviting me here to participate in this very important discussion. I'm just going to very briefly set the table for our discussion by providing some information on current electricity rates, what's driving the huge and frequent rate increases we're seeing reflected in our bills, and more importantly, identify specific actions that need to be taken to bend that cost curve. So with this first slide, you'll see that the rates of the three large electric utilities, PG&E, Southern California Edison, and San Diego Gas and Electric. Most importantly, I want to draw your attention to the bottom gray line. That represents the rate of inflation. So you can see over the last decade, electricity rates have been increasing unsustainably and to far above the rate of inflation. You'll notice that there has been a downward tick in the rates most recently. Public Advocate's Office expects that to be short-lived as costs have dropped out of rates, but there are several utility requests pending before the PUC, and costs that fund certain programs already embedded in rates are also increasing. This slide, you can see the primary cost categories of a customer's bill, and the primary cost drivers of those bills are wildfire mitigation activities, transmission and distribution system maintenance, upgrades and expansion, and excessive incentives and subsidies such as rooftop solar. Michael, if it's okay with you, I was just going to go into an outline that we have Public Advocate's Office has put on our website last month. 4 levers that we think need to be pulled, all of them, in order to bend that cost curve. And if you don't remember anything else I say today, please remember this. Without intervention, rates and bills will continue to increase unsustainably. We need all these levers pulled. So the first lever I'm going to mention is reduce the cost of day-to-day utility operations, which will provide savings that will be reflected in customers' bills the same year the PUC authorizes those reductions. The second lever is to lower costs of major infrastructure projects by lowering the financing or the borrowing costs associated with those projects. The specific projects I'm thinking about are transmission and undergrounding. The third lever is to phase out costly programs. Unfortunately, there are many programs funded by ratepayers that do not directly relate to the provision of safe and reliable service, nor do they advance states' electrification goals or clean climate goals. At minimum, we believe that these programs should have a sunset date, and we certainly think that new programs that are not cost-effective or don't have cost-effectiveness requirements should not be established. And the fourth lever is to revise rate subsidies and rate structures. Certain rates have overly generous subsidies embedded in them that drive up costs for customers who don't benefit or receive those subsidies. We need to revisit these incentive programs to make sure their costs are commensurate with the benefits they provide. So all these remedies involve hard choices by decision makers, but again, rates are so high, and again, without intervention, they will continue to increase. So we need to pull all these levers.
Carla, would you like to go next?
Sure, Michael. Thanks to the Stanford team for the invitation, and great to be on this panel with Linda and Caitlin. And well, I'll just start off with, we do believe that a decarbonized future will be the most affordable future. We need to get there. And we believe that to be so because when we're decarbonizing, when we're doing more electrification, we'll have more efficient fuel use, and we'll have more load growth, and those in combination will lead to lower bills. But the question before us is, how do we get from here to there? And even in that environment as well, what we're seeing in terms of a lot of the drivers of rates, we're seeing drivers that are really connected to the investments that we need to do climate change mitigation as well as adaptation. So again, keeping our collective eyes on the ball of addressing climate change ultimately is going to be the lowest cost outcome for society. And we as a sector play a really important role. So how do we set ourselves up to be able to continue to do that and be able to have electricity remain affordable? And so let me just start with maybe a general comment about rates, and then I'll kind of go to the framework that we're looking at affordability, which is very aligned with what Linda shared. So I'm really glad that she went first. First, I do want to acknowledge what Linda's slides do show, which is rates have gone up above the cost of inflation significantly. And we really saw that play out for our customers in 2024, where across the year, electric rates went up about 10%, but it was very volatile. The year started off with an almost 20% increase. We had 6 different rate changes. We had costs come out of the bill, costs go in the bill. And so that is a really unacceptable customer experience. We do see line of sight for rates coming down, and more so rates growing consistent with the rate of inflation. And I am happy to acknowledge that given that rate increase we saw in 2024, this year on PG&E's system, our average electric rate is lower than it was last year. And we are doing a lot of different measures to work to continue to put downward pressure on rates. So let me share what our framework is for affordability, again, which has a lot of similarities to what Linda shared. When we look at how do we actually do the investment that our customers need to address climate change, to evolve the grid, in order to do that, but keep rates not growing more than inflation, we deploy something called a simple affordable model. There's some key parts. One, in order to fund the investment in capital that's necessary to upgrade the transmission system, to upgrade distribution, we need to pull costs out in other places. And so there's a couple of ways we can do that. The first is reducing O&M expense. And Linda called that out, reducing the day-to-day cost. And that's an area where we're looking at our own actions, like what can we do to have a more sustainable cost structure? So we target O&M reductions in costs every year. Last year, we were able to reduce $750 million in cost that would typically go into the customer bill based on improving processes, having more efficient approach, pushing on cost reductions, doing the same amount of work or more, but for less. And so there's a lot of opportunity for us to do that. And then there are some expenses that are in the bill that we are not directly able to change, but we want to address. And those are some of the programs that Linda highlighted. Those are things that flow as expenses to our customers. So how do we look at programs and reduce waste in those programs, really look at what programs have accomplished what they were intended to accomplish, and then we have an opportunity now to sunset. Another area is efficient financing, right? And Linda talked about that as well. How do you reduce the borrowing cost? And so there's a couple ways we do that. One, very directly, is being investment grade. For us as a utility, as we're working our way back up to investment grade, that is costly for our customers. We pay more to borrow than another utility might. And so being in good financial health as a utility does lower borrowing costs. It's also going after lower cost loans and financing. We're really proud that PG&E received a $15 billion loan guarantee from the DOE. That's significant. That will allow us to offset or replace spend that is more expensive. So going after opportunities like that. And then, finally, another key lever is making sure we have beneficial load growth. If we have a load come on the system, how do we make sure that that comes on the system as the rate design is there to put downward pressure across rates? Some of the near-term things we've seen, load has been an impact from that as well, right? We saw a reduction in some of the load last year as we saw a rush to adopt NEM 2.0, for example. So there are things that have happened recently that really give us line of sight to what we need to do going forward. I do want to say one more thing about what's in our bills right now, because Linda highlighted a few areas. And one of the things we see is that about 32% of the bill relates to the actual generation, the cost of supply. About 22% is the transmission and distribution. And then about 31% of the bill I would call are costs that are associated with the policies to reduce climate change or adapt to climate change. Things like the enhanced vegetation management that we need to do in our systems, enhanced inspection to deal with wildfires, some of our public purpose programs. And so we need to really look at that category because that's where we have to work together in order to make adjustments. And it's notable that we find inspections and veg management are about 10% of our customer bill, about $20 or so. Undergrounding is 0.5%, less than 0.5%. So actually, we're not investing in the real capital that will have long-term benefits. We're doing annual expense year over year. We're looking for ways to drive those costs down, but also working with our public policy makers around the rules and regulations in those areas can help to put downward pressure on that cost category too. So I'll stop there and just say I'm really looking forward to talking about more our near-term opportunities as well as some of the long-term solutions.
Caitlin, you're up.
Thanks. And I first want to echo the appreciation for the invitation to be here. And thanks, Lane, for all the work that you have done and all the ideas you've put on the table. I really enjoyed your presentation as well. I maybe want to start by zooming out a little bit here. Electricity rates are undeniably a really important part of the affordability concerns we have in California. And I think Linda and Carla really laid out the scope of the challenge really well and potential solutions along with some of Lane's solutions. And electricity affordability impacts so many other aspects of people's lives. I mean, it is the same households who struggle to pay these utility bills that are also often struggling to pay the rent and keep the gas tank full, maybe even buy groceries sometimes. So what do they do when they need a new car or they need a new furnace or they need a new hot water heater? Some of these issues are exacerbated when electricity is really expensive. I'm not going to go out and buy an electric hot water heater when I can't pay my electricity bill already. So this is obviously a cost of living challenge and a climate challenge. And it's a challenge that demands, myriad solutions beyond just climate policy. But I do think that climate policy and cap and trade specifically can be part of a solution set, including the bill credits that Lane started off talking about, but other ways as well. And I guess the first point on that I would make is that, cap and trade is inherently the most cost-effective climate policy we have. Because it's flexible, a market can find the lowest cost path to emission reductions. So that means it's well positioned to help California meet our climate goals, which we should not lose sight of, while also keeping the cost of climate action under control and limiting how people feel them in many aspects of their lives. I'm sure everyone here has seen the Legislative Analyst's Office report from a few weeks ago, digging into some of these drivers of electricity rates. And I won't rehash all of that there, but I did think it was really interesting that they pointed out that this bill credit more than offsets the utilities' cost of compliance with cap and trade. So I think we should continue to see this program, both the mechanism, but also these rebates or bill credits, as part of the solution set to both climate and affordability. We also have a sort of built-in opportunity with cap and trade that's unique among climate policy measures to invest in ways that directly impact people's pocketbooks. And that utility bill credit is probably the most obvious example. And I'm excited to really think about options for how we can optimize that bill credit to address affordability for the Californians that need it most. Looking at across geography and where people are struggling the most to pay their energy bills because of high heat. Looking at low-income households who are struggling to pay these bills, thinking about, should this be a rebate that, as Lane laid out, people receive when the burden is highest, or even on a monthly basis, so they see a regular reduction in their bills. I think this shift in timing could really help with just month-to-month cash flow for some of California's struggling households. In addition to these questions of distribution of that credit, so what is the timing? What is the geography? Is it needs-based? I think we should also be looking at ways to further increase the overall pot of funding available for this credit. So how do we divvy up the pie differently, but also how do we increase this pie? And, perhaps it is supplementing some of the current allowance value that pays for this bill credit with revenue from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, or redistributing some of the free allowances whose value pays for this credit away from other entities that don't have a lot of risk, so more value can go into these bill credits. More broadly than that, we also have all of the investments from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And I have a few specific examples in mind of what could be done there that I think would have a real impact on the issues we're talking about. And maybe we can get into that in the Q&A. But I guess my core message is cap and trade is the most cost-effective climate policy we have. It's essential to meeting our climate goals, but it also is a really, really valuable tool to address affordability concerns, both through optimizing these bill credits and by some strategic investments with the revenue. And I'll say more about that later. So thank you so much, Michael. Back over to you.
Okay, well, that was a great introduction, both from Lane and then from our three panelists. And I just want to sort of open up with, I think there's a series of issues here that we're all touching on. One is affordability. The other is what our climate policies might have to do with that. And I want to take them in turn. Everyone spoke about the affordability issues and what they'd sort of broadly like to see. And of course, there are long and short-term solutions. I'd be curious if you have, and I'm sure all of you have an agenda for this year. What would you like to see get done this year on affordability that might make a meaningful difference for customers in California? Could you just share, and we can take this in the order of the speakers. Like, what is your perspective on kind of the top objectives to improve energy affordability for Californians, especially low and moderate income Californians? But like, as Caitlin pointed out, and I think about this a lot, this is, CARE and FARA, the programs that Lane's work focuses on, have kind of hard cutoffs about who is eligible and who is not eligible. Participation is fairly high, but by no means 100% in those programs and those discounting programs. And there's a bunch of people that don't qualify, but are still struggling to make ends meet in California. And of course, principally for reasons we're not talking about on this webinar, but housing cost. And so, but what are your top priorities this year to try to move the needle? Linda, how would you respond to that question?
Yeah, it's top of mind for us. So I know that there's a lot of interest at the legislature to put forward bills that would provide immediate rate relief. I think that is incredibly important. Some of the things I spoke about in terms of the levers need legislative support or leadership. So I'd like to see movement in terms of frankly, finding different sources of funding for programs that are currently funded by ratepayers, but again, don't have anything to do with the provision of electric service. or advance our decarbonization goals. That's going to require legislation most likely and very difficult decisions. So that would provide immediate rate relief. But I'd also like to see movement in terms of securitization, public financing, public-private partnerships in terms of things like transmission. Those things provide longer-term benefits, but there has to be a lot of groundwork laid, and it needs to start now. So I'll turn it back to you, Michael.
Carla, do you have a perspective as PG&E is thinking about this problem on behalf of their customers? Where do you think the most progress can be made this year?
Sure. So specific to this year, just picking up where Linda started, it is looking at what things should be funded through different mechanisms, through taxpayer funding, through perhaps cap and trade revenue, looking about what no longer should be on the bill. And I think there's two things. One, something shouldn't be funded by anything anywhere, right? So really doing an honest look at our programs and saying what has achieved its outcome or is no longer designed to achieve its outcome that we can just stop spending. And then there is what is spend that we want to continue to do that has societal benefits that we would fund a different way. So that's number one. And I will just comment on transmission. Linda raised transmission. Although we've seen transmission rates go up, it's still a relatively small portion of the bill. In 2024, transmission was 12% of PG&E's bill. This is an area where we do need to get investment, but utilities do know how to do the investment. And so actually having the room in the bill for transmission investment by having other things that really should not be in the bill taken off, I think is the ideal approach. In terms of some other near-term opportunities, we are supportive of doing some securitization of veg management expense that is currently in the bill. We've put some proposals forward there that could reduce customer rates about 7% each month for about 12 months. Now with securitization, it is true that you lower the bills, over the next year, and then there's some incremental costs in the future. But we really are trying to get at this acute challenge that customers now are paying for past spend, some of it that they weren't involved in, at the same time preparing us for the future. So I think securitization is a good mechanism to use for expense dollars in particular, because that can lower the bill in real time. And then, finally, continuing to move forward to make sure that we are making the right capital investments. So making sure, particularly on wildfire, which has been the big driver of our bill increases, that we're now looking at what is the role for undergrounding, for system hardening, and how that can offset some of the annual inspection and veg management expense. So we'd like to see some effort around moving forward, again, with the right level of strategic undergrounding.
Thanks, Carla. Caitlin, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to the climate policy side of this and just thinking about, we both need to address affordability and keep up our progress on climate action. I feel like this is a separate panel discussion, but the cost of inaction is staggering. And so, we have so much to do on the climate space. And so how do we solve both problems at once, basically? And like I said at the top, I do think a key part of that is the cap and trade program. So, reauthorizing that so we have long-term certainty of climate action. We have some long-term projections for greenhouse gas reduction fund revenue. We have a sense of long-term expectations around the climate credit on the utility bills. I think is absolutely essential. I would like to see that coupled with some sort of optimization of that climate credit. I also think it should be coupled with thinking about the greenhouse gas reduction fund as part of our affordability and equity and resilience solution. So really focusing some of that investment, certainly through GGRF, but I'll take general fund dollars too if I can get them, for programs that really directly impact people's home economy right away. And I'm thinking of things like the Equitable Building Decarbonization Program. A direct install program provides, no cost energy efficiency and electrification retrofits for some of the most vulnerable Californians, helps reduce their energy bills, makes them more resilient to extreme heat, improves indoor air quality, and of course has a climate benefit as well. That's a program that needs steady funding. And going back to where we started this conversation, it's a lot easier for people to take advantage of a program like that when their electricity bills are more affordable in the first place. And then the other piece that I think is interesting to think about, and both Linda and Carla have touched on this, but what climate mitigation and adaptation costs that are currently in our electricity rates, could be moved out of those rates and perhaps to the greenhouse gas reduction fund. Is this a way we can lower rates, lower overall bills, while ensuring the state is still taking the vital steps that we need to address climate change as we continue making ourselves more resilient to it as well?
Thank you. So I think it's Caitlin is already sort of making this connection explicitly, but I want to ask Linda and Carla to comment on the degree to which, or maybe comment more than they have so far, the degree to which they see the cap and trade program as a potential source of revenue. And that obviously is tied up with a complex politics around both the prior appropriation. So folks on the Zoom may or may not know that, a large fraction of the allowance value created by cap and trade is kind of spoken for in legislation. A lot of the kind of percentage allocations that go to various purposes, most notably toward the high-speed rail program, those decisions were made at this point a long time ago when we were all much younger people, several governors ago. And of course, as Caitlin has also pointed out, the GGRF is spent also, in a way that is intended to reduce emissions, but is also really broadened out from that. And it provides some really important, it creates revenues to do some really important things. I would just point to one of them, is helping people in the Central Valley that still drink from shallow groundwater wells to get onto public water systems so that they will not be exposed to high nitrate concentrations. That's a really important public health objective that GGRF money is supporting at present. But so how should we think about this interaction between our electricity bills and the challenges that everyone is trying to manage there? And I think reducing costs in the way that Carla and Linda have pointed to is a really important priority. And this idea that we want to move some of those things out of the electricity bill and somewhere else. And one of those somewhere else's is the general fund, which obviously where you're competing for against a broad universe of priorities, everything from public schools to housing programs to CAL FIRE's budget, or cap and trade, where there's a narrower set of priorities, but still quite broad, and where there's been a lot of political back and forth about how to allocate that money. What do you think about this idea generally? Should we make these connections? Does it make sense to at this point? Does it make sense to revisit some of the decisions we've made?
Yes, I'll take a stab at that. Yeah. I want to say that we made that connection a couple years ago when the commission started looking at the need for a fixed charge. All right, we put forward a proposal for an income graduated fixed charge, recognizing that the way rates are structured right now is highly inequitable. It's regressive. But we recognized that we needed a fixed charge that would cover the fixed costs of running and maintaining the electricity system, and that everybody should pay for that. Everybody should contribute. However, our most vulnerable customers needed to have some relief. And so we suggested that the climate credit be used to offset the fixed charge to low-income customers and those even on the margin of low income. And that actually means that the other customers wouldn't have to subsidize that discounted fixed charge. It would just be taken off the top. So everybody would benefit. And these costs that everybody should contribute to would be covered. So we made that linkage. We're still pushing for that. We don't have a fixed charge yet because the utilities are putting together their billing systems to be able to implement a fixed charge. But we still think it's a very good idea. It's very similar to what Lane has put forward, and it's time to take a look at those kinds of programs in general and figure out, okay, are the programs that the ratepayers are funding, and frankly, not just ratepayers, broadly, taxpayers, everybody's funding, are they supporting the state's goals in terms of decarbonization and electrification? Are we all oaring in the same direction? I think there are many programs that ratepayers are funding that it's very clear we're not. So I think a comprehensive look at all the programs and a comprehensive look at funding that's provided through the climate credit and other sources should be looked at with fresh eyes.
And so I'll offer some comments. And first of all, kudos to Caitlin for all of her comments tying back to the presentation. So I will comment on Lane's presentation. There's a lot to take upon with this topic. And I agree. We agree that there needs to be a connection between what's happening in cap and trade and the climate credit and affordability. And just taking a very pragmatic step back, the point of cap and trade is to drive decarbonization at the lowest societal cost. I mean, that's why we have that market mechanism. So it's important just to say, hey, we've been doing this for a while. Is it achieving what is intended to achieve? And we do know that affordability of electricity is going to be a key input to actually driving decarbonization, because a big part of getting to any net zero requires building electrification, it requires EV adoption, it requires individuals to make decisions, and they're going to be making those decisions looking at what their electric rate is. So to Linda's point, putting these costs, some of the climate mitigation costs into the electric rate is more regressive, which means it's worse for lower income Californians. And so we should be looking at these other funding opportunities. I think one of the things, think about what drives decarbonization. The electric sector and the gas sector have done significant work to decarbonize. I mean, just our past year, we delivered to our bundled customers 100% carbon-free energy. Now, that number can fluctuate because there's some compliance elements there, but we've done a lot to drive decarbonization. And so one of the things I think we need to watch out for as we move on to evolve cap and trade is actually having more carbon cost increases going into electric rates and gas rates, because right now we pass on the cost of carbon compliance to customers, and then we offset that with the climate credit. So there are also proposals out there that might actually increase that cost of compliance for the electric sector, a sector that has both decarbonized and also is going to be critical to remain affordable. In terms of how we think about, so yes, I think you can put more into the climate credit. When we think about the distribution, and to Lane's presentation, I just offer a couple of thoughts. We do want to make sure that we are supporting low-income customers, but I am concerned about the middle, right? We do have several programs that support low-income customers, and we see about just on our average electric bill, there's about an $86 difference between a care customer and a non-care customer average bill, right? And so what about that person who's right above the care line? We're seeing more people move into these programs that may or may not be low income, but they see really the cost differential. So, and middle income customers are paying into the fund, right? So they're paying these costs. So I do want to make sure that those who are paying for the cost get some of the benefit. Now, we do have customers who do self-generation who actually aren't being charged the same level of those carbon costs. So one of the proposal looks at, should those customers who do self-generation actually get the full climate credit when they're actually not bearing the full carbon cost? I think that's a real opportunity to look at that area as well. And then finally, I just want to reinforce, we really support the idea of shifting the timing of the climate credit to align when our customers are seeing higher bills. We know that there are peaky times with bills in the year, and it is important, as Caitlin noted, for customers to be able to predict their electric bills, to be able to manage their budget. And so allowing for that credit to come at some of those months would help with the customer experience that we're hearing from our customers they desire.
I want to ask a quick question from the audience. We're getting short on time, and but I think this is a really interesting question, and reflects a very thoughtful engagement with these issues. So we talked about the potential for load growth. A number of us, as we electrify, end uses that currently use fossil fuels. So EVs, heat pumps, things like that. That will drive rate reductions because it will mean that the total cost of the system can be spread over a larger number of kilowatt hours. Can any of you should we be subsidizing electrification even in populations that are not low income, because it will ultimately reduce rates for everyone, right? If we have load growth, just to take an obvious example, if relatively affluent people buy more new EVs instead of new internal combustion engine vehicles, and that is in part subsidized by the state of California, then that will cause load growth, and that may reduce rates potentially more than the cost of the subsidy, or perhaps not. Do any of you have thoughts about this issue of kind of how much, in general, we have moved in California toward focusing our subsidies on low-income people in the subsidies that are pushing for electrification. Does that make sense? Or do we know whether the subsidies can in some way pay for themselves, or some of the subsidies can pay for themselves, even when they're going to these higher income people?
So I'm happy to start on that one. And I'm actually glad you raised it, because what I should have mentioned, what I hope to see this year achieve, is a real focus from the state to support beneficial load growth. Because I think there's things that this state can do to recruit load, to encourage people to buy EVs, to do building electrification, and we want to do that. And I'll just start with, Michael, I don't think it has to be about adding incentives. I mean, there are incentives that already exist, for example, for EVs, so we're building electrification programs. It's about, one, getting people to adopt those incentives and use them. But then when they bring on, and there's an economic rationale for them without additional subsidy, to have that be a more cost-effective solution. Buying an EV is still a more cost-effective over the life cycle for a customer than using a fossil fuel car. Now, what we need to do, though, is to get them to, increase load, and to have that load come on the system at the right time to better utilize what we have. Our average capacity on our system usage is 45%. So there's real opportunity to add load. And where it really helps to lower rates faster is if you can add that load on parts of the system where there is capacity, because then we're not having to make as many investments on the cost side. But I think if we set it as an intention for ourselves that we want to add load, and we want that load to have an affordability benefit, I do think that will better inform rate design, it'll better inform where we direct investments in this state. But we see a lot of opportunity for that. We see EV load putting downward pressure on rates, data centers as well. And so we're doing work in the Silicon Valley to connect data centers and say, but make the intention, how does this actually put downward pressure for residential customers, which is what we need.
Yeah.
Other thoughts?
I would agree with many of the points that Carla just mentioned. I think that we have to have very smart build out of the distribution system in order to meet our electrification goals. And by smart, it means not just building wherever we can. It really is focusing on where is that capacity needed, and are the benefits going to show up? It's a very difficult, challenging thing to do, but we must do it. It is imperative that we do this as right as possible and have off-ramps if we're wrong. So I would say that there's a lot of emphasis on, we just need to increase load. Yes, but we need to do it smartly, both in terms of timing, in terms of rate design and providing those price signals to customers, but also looking at capacity on the existing system. Where do we need to build out? Where do we not need to build out? Thank you.
Well, on that note, I'm just going to thank the panelists. This has been an excellent discussion. You all have exceeded expectations, and they were pretty high to begin with. Caitlin, Linda, Carla, thank you so much. Lane, thank you for the presentation as well and the work. And this conversation is by no means over. I'm sure we will all be talking, and many of the audience also are participants in this conversation, and we welcome feedback on the presentation, and thank you again for your attention this morning. Have a lovely afternoon.